Before Rome dreamed of empire, before legions marched across deserts and seas, the eternal city had to prove itself not on distant shores, but in the hard soil of its own peninsula. In the middle of the 4th century BC, Italy was not yet Roman, it was a fractured mosaic of tribes, city-states, and fading powers, where the Etruscans still whispered the secrets of the Old World, where Greek colonies dotted the southern coast. And where one rugged people guarded the mountains like wolves protecting their den. They were the Samnites, warriors of the central Apennines, divided yet bound by blood, proud, fierce, and stubborn as the peaks they called home. They didn't wear togas or argue in marble forums. They lived in clustered hilltop villages, spoke Oscan, and carved a life out of a landscape that tested every breath. Their political unity, such as it was, came not from senators or consuls, but from a loose league of tribal councils, where leaders debated, tribes cooperated, and war was declared by consensus rather than decree. To the west, rising slowly but steadily, was Rome, a city built on ambition, shaped by conflict, and now eyeing the fertile lands of Campania, where Samnite and Latin ambitions were bound to clash. At first, Rome and the Samnites stood side by side. In 354 BC, they even formed an alliance, Rome recognizing the Samnites as a worthy power, and the Samnites viewing Rome as a useful friend in a peninsula full of threats. But alliances in ancient Italy were like weather on a mountain pass, brief, unpredictable, and often treacherous. Not long after shaking hands, the Samnites made a move to assert control over Capua and the Campanian coast, attacking the city of Sentinum and drawing in their rivals. The Campanians, desperate and on the brink of collapse, called for Rome's help, and Rome, ever strategic, answered. Because this wasn't just about loyalty, it was about opportunity. If Rome let the Samnites dominate Campania, it risked being boxed in. If it intervened, it could emerge as protector, and later, master, of the richest lands south of Latium. And so the First Samnite War erupted in 343 BC, a conflict that would test the still young republic and mark the beginning of one of the longest rivalries in its early history. Roman armies marched with confidence, and in a series of swift battles, at Mount Gaurus, Saticula, and Suessula, they crushed Samnite forces and gained glory. But just as Rome prepared to press its advantage, a crisis exploded from within. The Latin allies, who had marched beside Rome, bled beside Rome, but had no voice in Roman decisions, revolted. Tired of playing second fiddle to a republic that was growing hungrier by the year, the Latins turned their swords on their former partner, forcing Rome to make a painful choice, end the war in the mountains, or risk a civil one on its doorstep. Rome chose home. The Samnites were spared, for now, as Rome turned inward to crush the Latin revolt, and when the dust settled, the political map of Italy looked different. Rome had emerged stronger, not through conquest alone, but through policy. It restructured its alliances, tightened its grip, and drew a new line between citizen and subject. Some cities, like Capua, received full citizenship. Others received only partial rights, but with garrisons watching from within their walls. The message was clear: ally with Rome, and you survive. Resist, and you're next. Meanwhile, back in the highlands, the Samnites watched all this unfold with wary eyes. They had not been defeated, not truly. And they knew, as Rome built roads, founded colonies, and spread its influence deeper into Campania, that another war was coming. The mountains would not stay quiet for long. By the year 326 BC, the uneasy calm between Rome and the Samnites had unraveled completely, and the mountains once again echoed with the sound of war. This time, the stakes were higher. Rome wasn't just a growing city now, it was a rising power, with allies, colonies, and a hunger that stretched beyond its borders. And the Samnites? They hadn't forgotten the sting of betrayal, the shifting alliances, the Roman presence creeping ever closer to their sacred valleys. The Second Samnite War began not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper, when a Roman-friendly faction seized control of the key city of Neapolis and ousted the Samnite garrison. Rome, quick to act, claimed the city as its own, and the Samnites, furious at the insult, prepared for war. At first, Rome struck fast. One of their commanders, Quintus Publilius Philo, ignored orders and launched a surprise assault near Imbrinium, securing a major victory. It seemed like the same pattern as before, Rome advancing, the Samnites scrambling. But this war would not follow the old rules. In 321 BC, with Roman confidence soaring, the consuls of the year, Calvinus and Postumius, decided to take a shortcut through a narrow pass in the Apennines known as the Caudine Forks. They had been lured there by false intelligence, deliberately spread by Samnite agents disguised as shepherds, whispering rumors of an allied city under siege. The Romans believed it, and what followed was one of the most devastating military blunders in their early history. The Caudine Forks was a death trap masquerading as a mountain path, steep cliffs on both sides, no room to maneuver, no escape once inside. The Roman legions marched confidently into the first gorge, then the second, and only when the path was sealed behind them and the exits blocked by Samnite warriors did they realize they had been led straight into a noose. The entire army was trapped, surrounded, humiliated. No battle was fought, no swords drawn. Just silence, broken only by the distant laughter of Samnite scouts and the growing panic in the Roman camp. The Samnite commander, Gaius Pontius, now held the fate of an entire Roman army in his hands. Unsure of what to do, he sent word to his father, Herennius, a retired statesman. Herennius gave him two choices: kill them all, or release them without harm. One would break Rome's military strength for a generation. The other might win peace through generosity. But Pontius hesitated. He couldn't bring himself to slaughter men who had surrendered, and he feared releasing them would make his people seem weak. So he chose the middle path, the worst of all. He demanded a symbolic submission, a humiliation that would be remembered forever. The entire Roman army, from commanders to foot soldiers, was forced to walk, one by one, stripped of weapons and armor, beneath a yoke of crossed spears. No blood was spilled, but no wound cut deeper. Rome had been defeated without a fight, and the shame seared into its memory like a scar that would never fade. For the Samnites, it was a moment of triumph, but for Rome, it was a moment of transformation. Pride turned to rage, and humiliation turned to resolve. In the years that followed, there was a strange quiet. A 5-year lull in major conflict. But during that time, something extraordinary happened. Rome rethought everything. The way it fought, the way it moved, the way it trained. The old Greek-style phalanx, rigid and unwieldy, was quietly abandoned, and in its place emerged the manipular legion, flexible, modular, deadly. Soldiers were retrained not to fight as a block, but as adaptable units, capable of shifting with terrain, countering ambushes, and outthinking enemies who relied on brute force. Rome didn't just lick its wounds. It evolved. And when it returned to the field, it would be sharper, smarter, and ready to turn the humiliation of Caudine Forks into a lesson paid for in pride but redeemed in power. Because if the Samnites had taught Rome anything, it was this: humiliation can be temporary, but vengeance, when guided by discipline, can shape the destiny of a nation. The shame of the Caudine Forks didn't destroy Rome, it reforged it. In the quiet years that followed that devastating humiliation, while the world thought Rome was licking its wounds, something far more dangerous was happening beneath the surface. Rome wasn't sulking, it was adapting, rearming, retraining, and reimagining what it meant to be a Roman army. The rigid phalanx formations of old, with their tight rows and inflexible structure, were discarded like cracked armor from a fallen warrior. In their place came something revolutionary: the manipular legion, a fighting force not designed to hold the line at all costs, but to bend, flow, adjust, and strike with terrifying precision. Rome no longer moved like a single beast, but like a coordinated pack, each manipulous a piece of a puzzle that could rearrange itself in the middle of chaos. And when war resumed in full force, the Samnites discovered they were no longer facing the army they had once tricked into submission, they were facing something new, something smarter, something unstoppable. The Third Samnite War erupted in 298 BC, not as a border skirmish or a contest for a single city, but as a full-scale struggle for the soul of Italy. The Samnites, realizing the threat Rome now posed, did what they had never done before. They reached out to their former enemies and formed a grand coalition. Etruscans from the north, Umbrians from the heartland, even the fearsome Gauls from the far northwest were drawn into a final effort to stop the Roman advance. For the first time, it wasn't just Rome against one tribe or city, it was Rome against the peninsula. But Rome was ready. And this time, it wouldn't rely on improvisation or luck. Roads like the Appian Way had been carved into the land, allowing armies to move faster, supplies to travel farther, and commanders to respond with terrifying speed. Colonies had been founded across strategic points, each one a Roman island in foreign seas, projecting power and spreading Roman influence like seeds before the storm. Rome's grip wasn't just military, it was political, logistical, and cultural. As the great allied army of Samnites, Etruscans, Umbrians, and Gauls gathered in Umbria, Rome sent its largest army yet across the Apennines to meet them. 36,000 soldiers marched beneath the standards, each man trained in the new style of war, each one aware that the coming battle might decide everything. The two forces met near a town called Sentinum, and for 2 days, they stared across the fields, waiting. The Gauls and Samnites wanted to fight, but their allies hesitated, distracted by Roman raids that threatened their homes. And when the battle finally came, it wasn't just another clash of spears, it was a reckoning. The Gauls charged with fury, their chariots thundering across the plain, while the Samnites pressed hard on the Roman right. The line buckled, and for a moment, the Roman world seemed to teeter. But then, something remarkable happened. One of the Roman consuls, Decius Mus, realizing that his wing was on the verge of collapse, invoked an ancient ritual of self-sacrifice known as the devotio. He called out to the gods, vowed to give his life for Rome's victory, and then rode straight into the heart of the enemy lines, dying instantly in a storm of missiles and spears. It wasn't just a dramatic gesture, it was a spark. The Roman soldiers, inspired by his sacrifice and unwilling to let that death be meaningless, surged forward, rallied, and held the line. On the other wing, the second consul, Fabius Rullianus, had played a different game. He waited, watched, conserved his forces, and when the moment came, unleashed fresh reserves to overwhelm the exhausted Samnites. The Roman cavalry swept in from the flanks, crushing the remaining resistance, and by day's end, the coalition that had once threatened to surround Rome was broken. 25,000 of the enemy lay dead, thousands more were captured, and though Rome had lost nearly 9,000 of its own, the victory was total. Sentinum wasn't just a battle, it was the moment Rome proved it could stand against anything, even the united wrath of Italy. It had taken defeat, learned from it, and returned with a new system, a new mindset, and an unshakable belief that it was destined not just to survive, but to rule. And from that battlefield of blood and dust, a new Rome rose, not just tougher, but transformed, staring outward now not with fear, but with intent. The mountains had taught it resilience, the Samnites had taught it humility, and now, with those lessons burned deep into its bones, Rome was ready to conquer the rest of the world. The sun rose slowly over the plains of Sentinum in the summer of 295 BC, casting long shadows across a field where history was about to be written in sweat, steel, and sacrifice. On one side stood the largest army Rome had ever assembled, for legions of Roman citizens, for more from their allies, supported by cavalry and hardened commanders who had grown up in the shadow of past defeats and were determined never to feel that sting again. On the other side, a coalition of desperate powers, the Samnites, the Gauls, the Etruscans, the Umbrians, all of them ancient peoples watching Roman power tighten around them like a vice, all of them knowing that if they did not stop Rome here, they might never stop it at all. For 2 days the armies stared each other down, each waiting for the other to move, while Roman scouts harassed the edges of the enemy camp and reports trickled in that Etruscan and Umbrian forces had begun retreating to protect their ravaged homelands, leaving the Samnites and Gauls alone to face the storm. And when the third day came, it came with fury. The Gauls launched first, unleashing their terrifying chariots, bellowing, wheeled monsters dragging wagons behind them, crashing toward the Roman line with a thunder that shook the ground. The Roman horses panicked, men were thrown into chaos, and part of the Roman left began to falter. But they didn't break. They gritted their teeth, tightened their ranks, and fought back. On the right flank, the Samnites charged with the force of a people who had been fighting Rome for generations, determined to carve one last scar into their enemy's skin. And for hours, the battlefield hung in deadly balance, Romans and Samnites locked in brutal hand-to-hand struggle, the clash of swords drowned out only by the cries of the dying and the thunder of cavalry pounding the earth. Then something happened that would be remembered for centuries. One of the Roman consuls, Publius Decius Mus, saw that his line was crumbling. His men were losing heart. And in that moment, he did what his father had once done in a war decades earlier, he performed the ritual of devotio. He called on the gods, offered his life in exchange for Rome's victory, and rode alone into the thickest part of the Gallic line, his voice rising above the battlefield, his armor shining for one final moment before it was swallowed by spears. His death was instant, but its impact was seismic. The soldiers who saw it, who heard his vow and watched him fall, felt something ignite in their chests. They rallied. They pushed. They refused to let that sacrifice be meaningless. On the opposite side of the field, the second consul, Fabius Rullianus, was playing a different game. He had held back, waited for the Samnites to tire, conserved his strength, and now, with the moment right, he struck. Fresh reserves swept into the fray. Cavalry struck the flanks. The Samnites, exhausted from hours of grinding combat, began to buckle. Slowly, steadily, the Roman tide turned. The Gallic warriors, fierce and proud, now found themselves being pressed from the sides, their momentum shattered, their allies falling back. And then came the final blow. Rullianus sent his elite cavalry in a sweeping arc around the enemy's rear, a hammer to the anvil, crushing what resistance remained. The battlefield broke. The coalition shattered. 25,000 of the enemy lay dead, 8,000 captured, and though Rome lost nearly 9,000 of its own, it had won not just a battle, but the future. Sentinum was the moment when the old Italy, the one of tribal leagues and fragmented power, began to give way to something new. Rome had faced the full force of a united opposition, survived, and emerged stronger. Its military reforms had held. Its discipline had endured. Its gods, it seemed, had answered. And as the survivors limped away from the blood-stained fields, one truth became clear: there would be no stopping Rome now. The mountains had been conquered. The plains had been secured. And beyond them, a world was waiting. In the wake of Sentinum, the dust barely settled before the meaning of what had happened began to sink in, not just for Rome, but for all of Italy. The Samnites, those proud mountain warriors who had resisted Roman expansion for over half a century, were still breathing, but their spirit was broken. They would continue to fight in pockets and valleys for a few more years, clinging to the hope that maybe, somehow, they could still turn the tide, but deep down they must have known the war was lost. And it wasn't just a military defeat, it was the end of a world. The tribal confederacies, the regional leagues, the old balance of power that had once defined the Italian peninsula, they were collapsing, piece by piece, replaced by something newer, stronger, and far more ambitious. Rome didn't just win the Samnite wars, it became something different because of them. It learned to outmaneuver enemies, to build alliances not just with cities but with systems, to turn setbacks into evolution. The manipular legion, born in the pain of the Caudine Forks and tested on the fields of Sentinum, would go on to become one of the most effective military structures in human history. Rome's road system, begun as a way to reinforce distant colonies and deploy armies faster, now stretched across the peninsula like veins pumping power outward from the heart of the Republic. Colonies weren't just military outposts anymore, they were Roman DNA, planted across conquered lands to slowly but permanently transform the landscape into something familiar, something loyal. And the people, even those who had once raised arms against Rome, found themselves drawn into its orbit, not because they were forced to love it, but because Rome had mastered the art of offering enough incentive, enough structure, and just enough dignity to keep them invested. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't always fair, but it worked. By the time the Third Samnite War officially ended in 290 BC, Rome controlled most of central Italy. The Etruscans had been checked, the Gauls beaten back, the Umbrians pacified, and the Samnites, for all their courage and resistance, had been surrounded, outmaneuvered, and subdued. And for the first time, Rome didn't just think of itself as the strongest city in Latium, it began to see itself as the inevitable ruler of the peninsula. The gates of war, which had once opened to defend borders, now opened to shape them. And beyond those mountains, beyond those rivers and valleys once thought to be distant frontiers, lay new horizons: Carthage, Macedonia, the Hellenistic East, powers whose names would soon be spoken not as equals, but as future enemies. The Samnite Wars didn't make Rome famous. They made Rome ready. They gave it the tools, the mindset, and the confidence to reach for more. They taught it how to lose with humility and how to rebuild with brilliance. They taught it how to turn fear into discipline, chaos into structure, and resistance into legacy. And most importantly, they taught it that domination wasn't just about battles, it was about staying in place after the battle ended, building something that would last. The Roman Republic that emerged from these wars was no longer just an alliance of farmers and soldiers, it was a machine, fueled by ambition, protected by reform, and guided by a belief that its destiny wasn't to remain local, but to go global. So when people look back and ask how Rome came to dominate the known world, they often point to the Punic Wars, to Caesar, to the emperors. But those who know the deeper rhythm of history know the truth, that long before legions landed in Africa or crossed the Rubicon, Rome learned how to rule not by looking outward, but by surviving the fire within. The Samnite Wars were that fire. And from it, an empire was born.